Hello and Namaste from India. I'm Rohit Chakravarty, a PhD student at the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research in Germany. Today I'm going to present work that I did along with my PhD supervisors and collaborators from India. The title of the paper would be in the details below and or somewhere on this video. But essentially, we studied the change in bat diversity across elevations in the Himalayas. Now, this is a question that has fascinated biologists since the time of Alexander von Humboldt in the late 18th century and in the late 19th century rather, and where he was the first one to observe these changes in animals and plant diversities across elevations in the Andes. And since then, biologists have been looking for these patterns in different mountain systems across the world. So, in this study, what we did was we looked at three different elements of diversity. The first one, which is most widely studied all over the world, is called species diversity or simply species richness. Now, this is the change in the number of species that you see from low to high elevations. Now, you see the problem with this. It only tells you how many species, how many species are found in low elevations, in the mid elevation, and the high elevation. It does not tell you anything about what those species actually are, or how, evolutionarily speaking, how closely or how distantly related these species are, or whether they have a shared evolutionary history or not. So that's the second element of diversity that we studied, which is called phylogenetic diversity. And the third one, which is my favorite, is called functional diversity, which is a measure of the functions that different animals or plants might perform in the ecosystem. So, for example, if you measure, in the case of bats, if you measure their body sizes, their wing morphologies, or even their echolocation calls, these are good predictors of how a bat uses its habitat or what kind of insects it might be hunting. So, in this case, you can sort of predict the different functions of different species of bats. So that's another thing we measured. In order to do this, we studied bats. We caught bats from 1500 meters all the way up to 3500 meters in my study site in the Western Himalayas, a little west of Nepal. And we caught bats using thin mist nets, thin nets, which are like badminton nets. We caught them. We identified the species, and we measured all the parameters that I told you related to their body sizes, their echolocation calls, and from the literature, we also found out whether these bats were evolutionarily closely related or distantly related from each other. And here's what we found. We found that species richness, the number of species, drops as you go from low to high elevations. And this is a pattern that is very commonly seen with bats in different mountain ranges as well. But surprisingly, even though the number of species dropped, the phylogenetic diversity did not change, which means that despite the loss of species, the species at any given area were equally closely or distantly related to each other. So, there was no change in the evolutionary relatedness in species communities found in different elevations. But functional diversity dropped in the same way as species richness. So not only were there fewer species at higher elevations, they were also functionally less diverse. They had traits that were rather homogeneous. And this is a pattern that, uh, by from theory, such a pattern exists typically in harsher environmental conditions like high elevations, because um, there the conditions are so harsh that only certain traits are adapted to those conditions. Whereas at the lower elevation, which has more species, which is more productive, it gives opportunities for species to adapt to different kinds of habitats or to different kinds of resources, which also allow them to avoid competition among each other. So bats at the same elevation could also compete for those resources, and when they have different traits, they could adapt to different resources. So that was the crux of our paper. Now, okay, so why is this study important? This study is a tiny piece in a much larger puzzle that scientists are trying to answer all over the world, which is why or how are animals distributed across mountain ranges? And there's very little data available on this on bats. Much more importantly, the study is important in the light of climate change, because when climate change, the effects of climate change kicks in, and the base of the mountain or all over the mountain, if it gets warmer, animals are going to shift their ranges. Bats that live at lower elevations are probably going to move up. And now that we have data on functional diversity, which is a good predictor of how species might interact, whether they will compete with each other or whether they'll avoid competition among each other, function rates are a good predictor of those. So when the species move from one range to another, what will happen to them or to the bat diversity in the future? This study might act as a baseline to compare with future scenarios. With this, I would like to end the video. Thank you for listening, and I wish you all a very happy festive season. Thank you.